Bob Plunkett told a story, and I promise Ricky that we will let God get a word edgewise in a minute. But Bob Plunkett told a story, and I wish every problem was as easy to solve as that problem was that Bob told about. He told about a country that went down in a company from the U.S. that went down to Panama and started production for this company, and they hired Panamanians to work and paid them quite well. But there wasn't a lot to buy, and there wasn't a lot to choose from, and they were kind of they bargained, for even what they bought. Well, they had money left over. Well, the people began to drop out of work. They just quit work until they spent all their money up, and then they'd come back and want to work a few days again. Well, the guy said, we could, pay them less, or we could save some of that money and kind of put it in a retirement, I guess, and keep it for them for later. And or we could just shut this thing down. And the guy said, I know what we can do. We can give them a Sears and Roebuck catalog, and that will solve all the problems. And it did. But you think about what's been the result of that down to this very day. I mean, we went from that to credit cards and all this other stuff, but I wish every problem was that easy to solve, don't you? All right, we're looking tonight at a lesson, what is this, number 4, lessons from the Sabbath day. Now, we've spent 3 weeks now, and I promise you this is the last week, as we've looked on some things that relate to the Ten Commandments, and some of you are thinking, man, this is the one of the Ten Commandments that's not kind of replicated in the New Testament, and here you are spending a whole lesson on it, and you just spent 2 weeks on the other ones, and you're right. But I think this can be profitable for us tonight. Bible says all things written aforetime are written for our learning, Romans 15 and verse 4, and I trust that we're gleaning some things from the past to make us wiser in the present. In Genesis chapter 2, and Roy is kind of snail pacing through Genesis, but we're enjoying it. In Genesis chapter 2, in verses 1 through 3, it says, and the heavens and earth were finished, and the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he'd made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. Now, it seems to me that there's about 2,500 years that's going to take place from Genesis chapter 2 to Exodus chapter 16 before you're going to see that mentioned again. In Exodus chapter 16, you're going to see this kind of pick back up in Genesis 16, verses 21 through 30, when God is giving them the manna, and they are to pick that manna up, and he tells them a regulation about picking it up twice on day 6, so they would have some on day 7 and wouldn't have to pick it up on day 7. In verse 22, it says, it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And then he said to them, this is that which the Lord has said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath. Now it seems to me we've gone from Genesis chapter 2 to Exodus chapter 16 here, and just kind of being silent about this. And we'll not take time to read all that, but they were to pick up twice as much on Friday, and then not to pick up any on Saturday. And they were in Exodus chapter 20, as we've looked at this already, they were given in verse number 8, which was the 4th of the 10 commandments, to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger that's within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heavens and earth, the sea and all that's in them is, rested on the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and hath hallowed it. This law about the Sabbath day was given to the Jews. Notice in verse 2, verse 1 and 2 of Exodus chapter 20, the Lord spake all these words. He said, I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. This was given to the people who were brought out of the land of Egypt. It was given to the Jews, not to the Gentiles. You'll see that in chapter 31. And let me just read Exodus 31 and verse number 13. Exodus 31 and verse 13. Speak thou unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbath ye shall keep. And there's also a passage in Nehemiah, and also in verse 17 it says, It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, that they were to work in the 6 days and rest on the seventh day. And it was a covenant with the Jews that was stipulated by God. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 15. This law was never binding on the Gentiles, according to Romans chapter 2 and verse 14. Romans 3 verse 1 and 2 says, It's to the Jews were given the oracles of God. The Sabbath means to cease or rest, a cessation from gathering manna and from work, back in Exodus chapter 16. It was kept as a memorial. We'll get to this again before our time is up. It was kept as a memorial of deliverance from Egypt. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 15. It was a day of celebration. It was really a weekly Independence Day. A failure to observe was a capital offense. I'll give you some references there where even one was carried out where a man was stoned to death. He was picking up sticks on the Sabbath day. Moses went to the Lord and said, What shall we do to him? The Lord said, You take him. All the people go take him out of the town. All the people go out and stone him to death. And it was found in Nehemiah chapter 10. We talked about Nehemiah tonight, and the coming back and kind of getting things straightened out. And he talks about how that there was not to be any buying and selling, but buying and selling had been going on. And it was a violation of the Sabbath to do that. Very important to remember that the Sabbath was given to be a blessing and not a burden. And when we look tonight at some of these lessons from the Sabbath, you're going to see the Sabbath day, it was a blessing to man. It wasn't a burden to man. In fact, Jesus said in Mark 2 verse 27 that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In Matthew 23 and verse 2 and verse 4, the Lord talked about how that some bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne. And that could have had some of the traditions that they had bound about the Sabbath day that they were making people to keep. In Acts 15:10, they would talk about the yoke on the neck of the disciples, which again could have had reference to some of these traditions about the Sabbath day. So I just want us to look at, I may have 9 or 10, some of the lessons that we could learn from the way that the Sabbath day was supposed to be observed, and a lesson for us today. Number one is to trust God's care. God told them, I want you to pick up manna on day 6, and you'll have manna on day 7. Now, if you try to do that any other day except on Friday, it'll spoil, it'll rot, it'll stink, and the worms will get in it. But you do it when I tell you to do it, and I'm going to provide for you on that day that you don't pick it up. So it was a lesson really about trusting God's care in Exodus chapter 16, verse 23 to 26. What a lesson for us. Levi tonight challenged us with that Proverbs 3, verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not on thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy path. Think about God's providence and his promises. Remember what Abraham said in Genesis 22, verse 14. He called that place Jehovah-Jireh, which meant God will provide. And God does provide. He is our faithful God. You think about entering into this fall season, and I think about the time of harvest. We're seeing pumpkins and butternut squash and buttercup squash. I didn't know there was such a thing till a year ago. And man, if you've never had a buttercup squash to eat, it is precious. But just all of God's provision. God is so good to us. He provides. Let's seek him first, and he promises to provide for us. Matthew chapter 6. And there are several other passages there that talk about his care. Number 2 is a requirement to do exactly as God says. God said you pick up the manna 2 times on Friday, twice as much, and then don't do it on Saturday. Well, just as sure as the world, somebody violates that, and they pay the consequences. God tells them, don't do any work. You remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You rest on this day. And sure as the world, somebody's going to violate that, and they did, and they paid the penalty. There's a requirement to do exactly as God says, and you'll be blessed when you do it as God says. It's a shame they didn't live up to Exodus 19:8 and 24:7 that said, all that the Lord hath commanded will we do and be obedient. If they'd done that, they'd been blessed a whole lot more. But just think about how that we're blessed when we obey. Colossians 3:17 says, whatsoever you do, in word or deed, do all. Man, that's a powerful verse. Whatever, word or deed, all, in the name of the Lord. 2 John verse 9 talks about, don't go beyond. If you'll do it, if you'll abide in the Lord's doctrine, you'll have both the Father and the Son. John 4:24. To worship in spirit and truth. Revelation 22:18-19, don't add to or take away. We still must be obedient to exactly what God says do. And we can understand it. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 17 says, be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. Some passages, as Paul said of Paul's writings by Peter in 2 Peter 3, some are a little more hard to be understood, and we got to put a little more into it. But we can know what God wants us to do, and he expects us to be obedient thereto. Number 3, the need of work. Man, I've always said that this country, man, you take good old America, has been blessed in such a way, and if everybody that could work would, can you imagine what this country could be? And I had 2 benevolent cases, and man, I don't want to lose my compassion. But I had two benevolent cases this week to come in probably within an hour of each other. And but it's just somebody, that won't work most of the time. And it just breaks your heart. And I really believe that we can commit a sin by helping people that won't work. The Bible says if a man won't work, neither should he what? They need some responsibility about that. And I know sometimes there are little children involved and other things that kind of get pressing to us. But think about the example of God. God's still working. John chapter 5, verse 17. You think about all that God's doing right now. God's still doing a lot when you think about it right very now. And the first man was given the command, work's not a curse. And man was working in the garden before ever sin involved in the garden. He was given the challenge, the command to dress and to keep the garden. So in Exodus chapter 20, when he talked about the Sabbath day, he just preceded that with 6 days of work. And Ephesians 4, verse 28 says, let him that stole steal no more, but let him labor with his hand, that he might have to give to him that's in need. Think about our giving to the Lord's church and to good works. That involves work on our part. Work for able-bodied people with opportunity. I know somebody says, well, I'd take a job if I could find one. We're at a present time right now, and it's been that way for a while. I could probably get 5 jobs in one day. I believe I could. But a lot of people don't want to work when it comes down to it. Brother Nichols once said that he would crawl on broken glass to get to just sit in the corner of heaven. I believe I would crawl on broken glass to do whatever work I could find to support my family, my girls, and if it was cleaning out chicken houses or whatever, honest labor for work to be done. So let's remember that. And there's work for the Lord. In those last passages, it talks about work. Well, there's a call for workers. All right, number 4 is the need of rest, and there's a lesson there for us. And man, sometimes, we're burning the candle at both ends, and we need to remember that God says this old body needs to rest. In Exodus chapter 20, he talked about that day, the Sabbath day was a day of rest. Leviticus 23 and verse 3, 6 days thou shalt do no work, but the Sabbath is a Sabbath of rest. In Deuteronomy 5 and verse 14, it talked about you give rest to the animals. I really believe that mules ought to be the national emblem of this country instead of eagles, bald eagle. I mean, an old flop-eared mule is what made this country. And not too long ago, and I got a picture on my phone, if you don't believe it, I saw a bald eagle sitting on a dead dog right up here at Clear Creek Bridge. And I lost a lot of respect, and I was telling Randy Moody about that, and he said, I've seen 20 bald eagles on a dead cow in Minnesota. But you just think about rest. Animals need rest, and servants needed rest, and there's rest that's needed. And the human body, we're made out of, our feet's made out of dust, so to speak. Psalm 103 and verse number 4. And the Lord recognized the need for rest. But as we've worked hard, as I started to say about those old mules, I remember us plowing mules in the field and working mules in the logwoods. And man, my daddy, I'm telling you, he was a 6-day-a-weeker feller. And I thought, boy, I'd go out here and put them old, on a cold, frosty morning, and put them old bits in that mule's mouth and know that poor thing's got to snake them logs all day long just to get to come back and rest a little bit of evening. But they got Sunday off, though. They got Sunday off. But let's be a people that realize that the Lord has made us to rest. Mark 6:31, Jesus said, come aside and rest a while. Care for our bodies will involve rest. It's said about the Shakers that they put pegs on the wall to hang chairs during the day so they wouldn't be tempted to sit down. Well, most of us, we have something to tempt us to sit down from time to time, but there is a need of rest. Now, I can't think about this without that place lesson about eternal rest. You think about heaven, and heaven is going to be a place of eternal rest. Hebrews chapter 4. Revelation 14, verse 13, blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. Yea, says the Spirit, they may rest from their labor. Jesus said, come to me, all you that labor and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Job 3, verse 17, there's a place where the weary are at rest and the wicked cease their troubling. I know you want to go to that place, and so do I. All right, number 6 is the need to think compassionately toward others. Whether it be animals, or whether in Exodus chapter 20, the animals were to get rest, but also your hired servants were to get rest too. And it was a time for everybody to rest. So the need to think about others, and think about a lesson like that for us. Do we care? We were privileged to go over to Burleson Monday night, wanted to see Drew Kaiser. Drew just lost his mother, and Drew preaches at the Iceville Road Church at Leeds, and Drew has Parkinson's disease, and it's really hitting him pretty hard now. And but he had a lesson on the heart of Jesus, the heart of Jesus. He talked about the Good Samaritan, and how that the Good Samaritan, he wasn't inconvenienced by others in need. And you think about sometimes, if it's an inconvenience to us, like it might have been to the priest and the Levite, but to the Good Samaritan, he overcame the inconvenience, which keeps us sometimes from being compassionate. He talked about also how that he saw all humanity, not just, those of his own people or whatever. And the Bible challenges us to do good to all, especially those of the household of faith, but we need to be compassionate toward other people. And I give some verses on that. Number 7 is a time for family. Man, you think about how the Sabbath day had to be a day that was a blessing to family. Dad's supposed to be home that day, wasn't he? Mom's home. The children are home. Everybody's home. And it ought to be a day to bless family. That's why I said a while ago that the Sabbath was to be a blessing and not a burden. And, you think about a lesson for that today. Romans chapter 1, verse 30 and 31, and 2 Timothy 3, verse 2 and 3, both of these passages and both verses in each passage, I just put one of them down, but in each passage it talks about being unthankful and without natural affection. Now you think about that today. Without being unthankful and without natural affection. This last Sunday, my daughter works at the hospital at Florence, and she was working Saturday night, and I was on the phone with her after I got to the church building about 7 o'clock. She gets off at 7, and I talking her home so she would stay awake. She said, "Dad, it's been a pretty rough night." She said, 3 months ago, I helped deliver a little set of twins, a little boy and a little girl. They're 3 months old, and one of them came back in last night. And that little girl has 7 fractures in her face and in her arms, I believe it was. She said, "Daddy," she said, she had a ruptured spleen. Said her little tongue was even bruised. I don't know if somebody threw her up against a wall or what. And then here's, Charity's helped deliver this little baby 3 months ago, and now she's trying to save its life again. And they had to send it to Huntsville, and I hope it's okay, and I prayed for it a lot. And she said, and just right after that, here comes a lady in, and she's 39 weeks. Her water broke at 12:30 in the night. And she gets there a little after 1 o'clock, and she's got all of her bags, and she's got her sign that it's a girl, to put on the door. And said, we get her hooked up, and there's no heartbeat. No heartbeat. She said, "I felt the baby when I went to bed move." And Charity said, "It's just perfect looking little girl. Did have the umbilical cord around its neck one time, but Charity said, I've seen a baby born with the umbilical cord around its neck 4 times. And then sometimes you'll see 1 time, and they die." But anyway, it was just family. And you think about time for family. And here was a couple that just so anxious, their first child, 23 years old. And then here's another that, I don't know what that guy did to that precious little girl. But without natural affection. And we learned even from the Sabbath that there was a time for family. Also that we belong to God. In Exodus 31, it talks about sanctification related to the Sabbath day. We are set apart to belong to our God, and there's some verses about that. We are His special people. Also, the desire for worship. In Leviticus 23 and verse 3, in relation to the Sabbath, it referred to the convocation. That word carries with it the idea of assembly, that they did come together on the Sabbath at times to worship. Luke 4, verse 16, we find the Lord on the Sabbath day standing up to read. In Acts 16, you remember Lydia and some other women are down by they don't know any better at this time, a law that's been kind of abolished, but they're down at the riverside on the Sabbath and they're worshiping. So it's a desire for worship. And I have a lot of passages that talk about our desire for worship. It's also in relationship to the Sabbath, it was a day to do good. You remember when the Lord healed a man on the Sabbath day, and he was brought into question about it, and he asked them, if you had an ox in the ditch, would you not get it out on the Sabbath? And he said, it was a day to do good. Reminds me of Proverbs 31 about the virtuous woman, that she'll do her husband good all her days and not evil. And certainly the Sabbath was never a day to do that which was evil. And so a lot of verses there that talk about doing good. How many people in the Bible can you think of that was called good? Somebody? Barnabas, Acts chapter 11, verse 24. Barnabas was called a good man. Think of another one. Joseph of Arimathea in Luke 23 and verse 50 was called a good man. But a good man must do good. And Barnabas was called a good man. You think about all the good that Barnabas did. So it was time to do good. It was also a time to draw closer to God. I mean, you can't read these passages about the Sabbath without realization. These folks were drawing closer to God. And oh, how we need to draw nigh to God. And as Brother Levi talked about a while ago, as we grow older, to grow older gracefully, and for our love to become deeper, and our hearts purer, and our faith stronger, and our hope brighter. And truly, it's a time to draw close to God. I visited some people this very week, and LT's dear wife, Joanne, one of them, Sister Spivey. And you just think about, man, I know they're just laying there, and every day they're drawn a little bit closer to the Lord. And we need to be doing that, whether we're well or whether we're sick. But also it was a day for memory. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 15, they were to remember that this was a day of deliverance. And they would remember that. The Bible says, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. How often is that to be kept? Every Sabbath, wasn't it? The Lord didn't have to say, remember every Sabbath. He just said, remember the Sabbath day, and that every time it came around, that's the way you do it. Well, somebody says today, you people take the Lord's Supper, and you take it every Sunday. It'll lose some of its significance. Well, they were told to remember their deliverance from Egypt. Deliverance from sin is a whole lot more important than deliverance from physical slavery. And they were told to remember it every Sabbath. And we'd remember the Lord at his supper with the King, every first day of the week. So, a day for memory. But then last of all, think about the day for us. The day for us is not the Sabbath. We come to the New Testament, it's the first day of the week. Colossians 2 and verse 14 talks about an old law that was nailed to the cross, and that was the law to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We, in Revelation 1 verse 5, the Lord's Day. Acts 2 verse 1, the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost was always on what day of the week? First day of the week. And Matthew 28 verse 1, the Lord was raised from the dead on the first day of the week. The early church in Acts 20 verse 7 met to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. 1 Corinthians 16, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you give as you have been prospered. As our brother Ricky said a while ago, it's not a day for pleasure and profit. God gives us 6 days. Don't take the other one to yourself. We need to think about that. The Lord often gets squeezed out of his day. And I've gone over. The last thing right there is a lesson that Brother Levi Sides had, and it's a summary of the 10 Commandments. And I think it's really, really great. God's place in our lives matters. Have no other gods before me. Worship matters. You don't make a graven image and fall down and worship it. God's name matters. Don't take his name in vain. The worship on the right day matters. To them it was Sabbath day. To us, it's the first day of the week. Family matters. Honor your father and mother. Life matters. Don't murder. Marriage matters. Don't commit adultery. Respecting others' properties, rights matters. Don't steal. Our word matters. Don't lie. Being satisfied with our blessings matters. Don't covet. Thank you for being here. Let's be dismissed in a brief prayer.